It's the Yukon Poly Podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson. I'm here with a man who has been and always shall be my friend, Professor Jeffrey Dudas. And that has never been more true than over the last couple of days, where we've watched a great movie about friendship, camaraderie, love, loss. Yep. We've watched Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Beyond the human evolution is Khan, a genetically superior tyrant. Exiled to a barren planet, banished by a starship commander he is destined to destroy. Left for dead, he has survived.
I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up. There she is. There she is. Ah!
Shield collapsing, Captain.
Can you evade their power? A few shots, sir.
Not enough against their shields.
The base is starboard.
Scotty, I need warp speed in 3 minutes or we're all dead. I've done far worse than kill you. I've hurt you. And I wish to go on hurting you. I shall leave you as you left me. Marooned for all eternity. Buried alive. Buried alive. Sean! Sean!
At the end of the universe lies the beginning of vengeance. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
And we've watched Space Seed.
And we've watched Space Seed.
Yeah.
Space Seed, of course, being the sort of preliminary or preambulatory. No, that means before you can walk. The
6 and 1.
Yes,
Yeah.
the preface episode.
Yeah.
The episode of the original series where Khan Noonien Singh, the protagonist of the movie Wrath of Khan, is introduced. And I had said to you, I'm much more familiar with this movie and maybe Star Trek as a whole than you are. And I'd said to you, Star Trek 2 stands alone and Khan is introduced and there's some backstory, but you don't really need to know the backstory, which is in Space Seed, in order to understand the movie. And then I sort of had a panic over the last couple of days because I did rewatch Space Seed, and I thought, actually, this is much more tightly tied into the movie than I thought it was. And so I kind of prevailed upon you late last night to urgently watch Space Seed, and you did, and maybe we should talk about Space Seed first as a way into the movie.
Sure, I think we should talk about Space Seed first, but we should backtrack a little bit and talk about Star Trek and about our respective experiences with the Star Trek universe.
Okay.
So in our last video, we did a deep dive on The Dark Knight, and the idea there, you might remember, was that we were each going to try to explain to the other what it was and how it was that a film that we both really like a lot was important and worth taking seriously and thinking about for these purposes. And so last time it was kind of my choice of The Dark Knight. This time it's your choice of The Wrath of Khan. But I think, as we had talked about in the last video, kind of our experience with those universes, I think it's worth revisiting and beginning with a kind of a sense of our respective experiences with the Star Trek Enterprise, pun intended, I suppose.
Yes.
We'll start with you because you are a big Star Trek fan, and you have a pretty extensive, I think, history with this universe. So, how is it that you came to Star Trek? What does it mean to you? Where do you rank The Wrath of Khan kind of in the trajectory of your fandom?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously I'm although you might not know it from looking at the kind of decrepit walking corpse that that greets you this morning, I'm not quite old enough to...
Now you're just fishing for compliments.
I'm not quite old enough to remember the original series. And I would have been 4 years old when Wrath of Khan came out, so I certainly didn't see it in cinemas. I would have seen it on TV in reruns. I think the first Star Trek I was introduced to was The Next Generation, which was kind of mid-80s, and so I would have seen in first run. I actually remember very vividly, it was shown on British television at 6 p.m. on Wednesdays, and then usually there was an episode of the original series after it at kind of 7 p.m. On Wednesdays. So my first introduction was probably Picard and The Next Generation, but I think pretty soon thereafter I watched this movie, I watched The Wrath of Khan, which for me is not only, the premiere Star Trek, but I actually genuinely think is a very important movie. And I think a movie that transcends Star Trek themes for reasons that we'll talk about. And that's not an uncommon viewpoint, I think, among Star Trek aficionados. This movie I've always found very moving. I think I've had different relations to it, at different stages in my life. I think when I first watched it as a young boy, I think I found it quite scary, actually, and probably a little bit advanced from what I could cope with, and kind of gave me nightmares. It's a very brutal movie. I think as I got older, I started to see it as a kind of exciting action-adventure movie. I think as I got older still, I became very interested in it as a sort of case study in leadership and in decision-making under pressure, and I thought it did those things very well and said something very interesting. And then as I've become older still, and have become a father, candidly, it started to re-resonate with me in an emotional way as a story about fatherhood and sometimes fatherhood's absence. And then I think throughout all of these iterations, the central emotional theme and the central emotional climax, the loss of Spock. I don't know why, maybe you can explain it to me, but I've always found that unbelievably moving and profound, actually in quite a physical way, and I find it more times than not, I'll find myself in tears at the end of the movie, and I know what's coming, and it's silly, and I'm old, and I get it, but there is something about it that's very emotionally moving. And one thing I'm interested in understanding today, maybe seeing the movie through your eyes, is to what degree am I actually having a purely emotional, almost primal reaction to this movie that is not visible to people who don't have this long history with it. And I'm just being sort of manipulated, and because I've been manipulated since I was a young boy, it now is a thing that just moves me, in a very personal way, versus to what extent am I having a sort of intellectual and aesthetic reaction to a piece of art that actually works. And that, I think, will be an interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, I think that will be interesting. I look forward to being your therapist today. So.
What about you? What's your
So, I mean, my history with Star Wars is a bit different.
Now,
Star Trek. now, that is
everyone has stopped watching this video who tuned in for Star Trek discussion.
So
we need to perform some exorcism ritual at this point.
But one thing I do want to circle back to is your earlier Freudian slip in which Khan was the protagonist rather than the antagonist.
Oh, did I say that?
So I find very interesting. So I want to make sure that we hit on.
It's also possible I don't know the difference between the two words.
Well, that's also possible, I suppose. But my experience with Star Trek is a little different. When my first experience with Star Trek were the original series because
you're just that old.
I'm just that old, but they were in reruns, right? There was very few syndicate. I don't know how it was in England at the time, but there were very few options on American TV in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and so the syndicated shows were much more prominent at that time, I think, than they are now. And Star Trek was one of those shows that was in regular syndication. And so my older brother was has always been a big fan of kind of science fiction-y, fantasy sorts of stories. He really loved the old Star Trek shows, and so we would watch them. And so I presume that I have seen nearly every episode, but not lately. And then I remember seeing The Wrath of Khan first on TV when I was a boy. And I had the same kind of terrifying experience with it that it sounds like you did, and especially the worms crawling into and out of the ears of Chekhov and, the commander, which I thought was very terrifying. So, and then I have seen a great many of I've seen all of the original cast Star Trek movies. I've seen several of the later movies with Picard. I didn't spend much time watching The Next Generation, and I have essentially no experience with any of the other shows after that. I also, in case there are Star Trek fans who have not yet turned on me and therefore on the video, I should also say that I actually quite enjoyed the J.J. Abrams reboot movies, which I know are, controversial entry into the Star Trek universe. We won't go into that, but I quite liked them. Although I do think Khan is better.
Yes.
Than all of those. It's interesting to me to hear you talk about the emotional character of this movie, because I agree that I was thinking about the ways in which this is really kind of a small story. And by small, I don't mean in a derogatory way. I mean it's a small story of intense human emotions, and the tracing of a kind of trajectory of human growth, or we'll talk about this, either human growth or kind of the limits of the ways in which people can change. And that's unusual, I think, for a movie that maybe at first blush seems like a big starship action movie with lots of fighting and chasing and adventure and excitement. And actually the movie itself is quite small, it seems to me. That it's very contained. This is not a story really in which our protagonists are trying to save the universe, right? I mean, they're really just trying to save themselves. And there are some ancillary benefits from preventing, this tyrant from having a weapon of mass destruction. But that really feels secondary to the kind of the quest for survival that is really the core of the story. And it's a character study as well, which is, I think, unusual for a movie of this kind of genre, right? So I think there's a lot to talk about here, and I guess we should, to the extent that this is a movie about big ideas, right, and about sort of the surface politics, what do we think of the movie? I mean, I think there's not as much here, in other words, as maybe in some of the other stories that we've been talking about in terms of these big, on-the-surface kinds of politics.
So that's interesting. Before we get into that, though, we made a huge faux pas, which is we trailed a discussion of Space Seed that we never
that's right.
we never paid off.
So Space Seed.
Space Seed.
Yeah.
Space Seed, an original series episode in which
season one,
but seasons used to be massive, right? There's like 30 episodes, and so there'll be like 4 seasons. And
so this is at the end of season 1 as well. So it's probably it feels like the show's starting to find its footing.
I think so. And the basic premise is the Enterprise finds a derelict old Earth-style starship from 1996. I think we must have forgotten we launched all those starships, including the Botany Bay. Yeah. Aboard which, in cryosleep, is a mysterious party of persons from Earth's past. Once revived, the leader turns out to be Khan Noonien Singh, who is a genetically engineered, essentially Superman. Superior strength, superior intellect, superior sort of will to power.
Yes.
Who had been developed to be part of a new ruling class on Earth. As part of a eugenics experiment, a social, actual genetic, but also social engineering experiment. One presumes with utopian dimensions, with utopian undertones, these people will be superior. They will therefore rule in a superior fashion. And in the Star Trek universe...
And in fact, McCoy, just to stop you there, McCoy in the episode does put all of the blame for this on the scientists, which is going to reprise a later skepticism that he offers in Wrath of Khan.
Precisely.
Scientists.
Precisely. And, the Earth's history in the Star Trek universe is one of basically unbroken disaster from the First World War through the Second World War, the Third World War, and the Eugenics War, until the realization is it comes upon the species that we really can't operate in this kind of anarchic nation state situation. We need to band together as a united planet and look outwards. So Khan is from the past, and not in this case Kirk's past, that will be the movie, but actually Earth's past or humanity's past. And then the episode proceeds with Khan being afforded hospitality and Kirk kind of wondering, like, what do we do with this dude from the past? And he has all this like potential and skills, but he's also a murderous tyrant. And it does almost seem like many members of the Enterprise crew, Kirk himself included, sort of vaguely know the history of this period, but have misremembered or failed to learn important lessons from it. There's also the interesting counterpoint of the ship's historian, Martha MacGyver's, who Kirk is very sort of dismissive of as, you know, as a sort of space action hero. He doesn't have a lot of time for these book people who read the.
Well, he doesn't even know her name.
Doesn't know her name. And it's like, they see a chance to do something useful on the ship. She's very attracted to Khan, who is, you know, objectively a beautiful man and a very charismatic individual, but also has this kind of magnetism that the story says exerts a particular influence on her because she is so enamored of Earth's past.
She's enamored of Earth's past, but she's enamored of Earth's past through the lens of strongmen rulers.
Yes.
All of her, the show makes it, she's an artist, so all of her cabin is essentially, her quarters are essentially decorated with various art forms, sculptures, paintings, and the like of famous antique strongmen in Earth's history. And so Khan is like a living fantasy. For her.
And the gender politics here are kind of fascinating.
Not good. They're not good.
You know, I think, you know, the implication is that she finds the modern man, I don't know what you'd say, like too effeminate or too, you know, refined to be primordially attractive in a way that maybe you didn't get that sense, so that's always been.
I didn't get that sense exactly, but I mean, what that storyline does is this is a very common kind of gender politics storyline in the realm of science fiction, which is that you've got this external subversive force who comes into an otherwise functioning community and who, in spite of the fact who the audience knows has very clear malintent, it's typically, this is a force that's able to worm its way into and undermine the community through essentially through the manipulation of naive women.
Yes, who are portrayed as the weaker and naive members of the community. The weak point
into the polity or into the community is always this kind of lascivious, ditzy, naive woman who lacks the acumen, but really lacks the self-control, to be able to understand and to resist the aberrant force that is being welcomed in. So the episode leans hard into that storyline,
which is an amazing triumph of a view of gender over the objective facts, which is, as the ship's historian, she would be the most intellectual person on the ship. She certainly would have a greater hinterland than Kirk, the kind of head bureaucrat / swashbuckler.
Exactly.
But the gender, well, he's the man, so he must see through this manipulation. She, despite her intellect, cannot.
So it's bad. It's bad gender politics, for sure.
And so Khan kind of manipulates his way and kind of makes an ally of the ship's historian, who helps him to temporarily seize control of the ship so that he can resume his imperial fantasies. In the end, he is overcome by Kirk's, ingenuity and daring, and actually Kirk bests him physically.
By using some kind of
spanner or something he pulls out of the engine room
or something that he finds.
Smacks him in the stomach. And so you think, well, okay, that's it. He's off to prison. So see you later, Khan. Kirk instead, in a rather remarkable turn of events, convenes with some ceremony. He puts on his nice uniform and everything. Convenes a hearing where he will unilaterally decide the fate of not only Khan but his 80 followers. And comes up with the decision that prison is not for him, or at least not a conventional prison. What Kirk is actually going to do is essentially resume this social engineering experiment, drop Khan on a nice planet.
And a hospitable planet. Now, they're clear that it's not great.
Like Australia is, of course, the analog here.
Yes. But presumably a planet that is capable of habitation, that appears to have beings on it, who Khan is very clearly going to conquer. I mean, that's the point, right?
Yeah. So and the kind of sign off is it will be fascinating to see what this man is able to build in 200 years, which is very, very interesting from the standpoint of some classic science fiction themes of utopia and dystopia. And it does seem that for a series that had mostly portrayed humanity's past as a childhood or an infancy and a lost cause from which nothing much can be redeemed, it was holding out the possibility that maybe the old ways were okay, and maybe like the strongmen had a point.
Yep.
And strongmen, if put in the right situation or properly, cooked up in the test tube, that form of governance may actually lead in a utopian direction. That certainly is the hypothesis Kirk is intending. Or is intending to test.
It maybe. I mean,
without ever checking on the test.
I think it's hard to know, right? Because there's this scene, a couple of scenes earlier, I think, before Khan escapes from his lockdown that Kirk has put him in which, McCoy and Scotty and Kirk are all and Spock are all sitting around this table, and everyone except Spock is professing their admiration for Khan and for his sort of tyrannous ambition. And of course, Spock is puzzled by the ambition, and there's some mealy-mouthed stuff from Kirk about how, well, humans, we can admire people even as we hate them, or some such. And so it's not clear to me how much of Kirk's decision is this kind of like barely bridled enthusiasm for the ambition. For the extra ambition of Khan, and how much of it is this kind of, well, maybe the utopian thing will work. It strikes me as, it doesn't seem like in that moment that Kirk is kind of leaning into utopian thinking or fantasies. I mean, I actually think, and this is why I think the episode is such an interesting prologue to the movie, is that, I mean, this is a moment in which essentially Kirk has the ability to deal with somebody who he knows is a murderous tyrant, who he knows has the skill and certainly the ambition to continue his tyranny on others. And rather than incapacitating this threat, he literally turns him loose and facilitates his ability to be the exact murderous tyrant that Khan intends to be. It is a stunning act of irresponsibility by Kirk, who then just jets off because he's not going to have to he doesn't think he's going to have to deal with the fallout of Khan. And so it's a brilliant callback, I think, on the part of the writers of The Wrath of Khan to essentially make Khan it's when the tail comes back to whip Kirk in the ass 15 years later, like, this is all his fault. Everything that happens in The Wrath of Khan is entirely and completely James Kirk's fault.
Right.
And I think that's where you start to really dig into the what makes the movie such an interesting character.
Yeah, I agree. And as I rewatched that scene this time, I had the thought that Kirk is coming off to me. He's so insouciant with what he's doing, and he's coming off to me as like the student in your class who hasn't done any of the reading, but has been called upon to contribute something to the discussion, but has this like ability to just hear a keyword in the question and deliver something with great sort of flair that sounds very like they might have done the reading, and also is very provocative and get to the people talking and all the rest of it. And then Spock is the person who did the reading very closely and is, it's not really what what the reading says. You're just kind of making this up, aren't you?
Right.
But is polite enough and refined enough to just raise an eyebrow rather than say, hang on, have you really studied the history of this man and his past behaviour?
Exactly. And the other thing about Space Seed that I really noticed watching it was comparing and contrasting the abilities, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later in regard to the movie, but comparing and contrasting Kirk's tactical abilities in the two moments in time. So in Space Seed, when the Enterprise first encounters Khan's ship, lifeless ship, almost lifeless ship in space, Kirk is immediately wary and immediately puts the ship onto red alert. Contrast that to how he experiences what's going to happen in the Wrath of Khan when they come across, the ship that Khan has commandeered, right? In which he's very slow to react to this situation. And in fact, so slow that he, again, is the author of extreme misfortune. So it's interesting to think about the ways in which his skills have degraded over the 15 years as well. Because it's a totally different response.
Right. Yes, I think that's a very acute point, and we should talk about that scene, in some depth when we get into it, which I think we should probably do.
Yeah.
Do we need to say anything else about Space Seed, or shall we?
No, let's
jet forward to the movie?
Okay, welcome back. So let's talk about the run up to the movie itself. Let's talk about the choice of directors here, Nicholas Meyer. Let's talk about some of the choices that he's making in regard to the vision that he's bringing to the movie.
Yeah, so after the original series, after Star Trek got cancelled rather famously, there was a great sort of upswelling in appreciation and in fan efforts to get Star Trek back off the ground, and there's then a sort of 15-year period where various attempts are made to relaunch the Enterprise, to relaunch Star Trek. Roddenberry has an idea for Star Trek Phase 2, he would have called it. There's an animated series, and then eventually there's the motion picture, Star Trek the Motion Picture, which is an extremely expensive endeavor. Incredible amounts of money are thrown at this. They bring in a director, Robert Wise, who's a acclaimed classical film director. Jerry Goldsmith, the greatest composer of the time, is brought in to do the score. The special effects are, tons and tons of money is thrown at it. The one problem they have is that no one writes a story for it, and so it's this sort of very stately movie. And I mean, the old joke of it is, you can start watching the motion picture and you start a scene and it might be like Enterprise leaving space dock, and you can kind of get in your car, go get a car wash, go get a coffee, have breakfast.
I literally can't remember a single thing.
The same scene is still going on. The Enterprise has moved 20 yards down the out of space dock. And so that's a movie that just about washes its face, is the term, makes its money back, but is not the great success that people were hoping for. And is largely seen as kind of too slow, not character-driven enough. These are the major problems. So there is a desire then to make a second movie. It's still a valuable franchise, and we've got to remember this is going on at the same time as George Lucas's Star Wars are proving that there's a great cinematic great cinematic appetite for another movie. And there's actually an interesting time between Wrath of Khan and Return of the Jedi, the last of Lucas's trilogy, which are being shot at broadly the same time. Lucas intends to call Return of the Jedi Revenge of the Jedi, which creates a problem for Paramount, which has this picture, The Wrath of Khan. Aren't these quite similar titles? So Lucas says, you can't do that, it's my title and all the rest of it. And someone at Paramount who understands the Star Wars universe says something very clever, which is, do the Jedi really take revenge? Aren't they supposed to be these kind of placid? And Lucas is like, oh yeah, maybe I'll call it like Return of the Jedi. And I actually mangled that story. Wrath of Khan was originally Vengeance of Khan, so it was even worse, Revenge and Vengeance. Right. And so Lucas changed his title, and Paramount blinked a little bit as well, and Vengeance of Khan becomes Wrath of Khan. Brought in to direct this movie is little known, start of his career, Nicholas Meyer. This is important because Meyer is called to direct the movie at a point at which the script is in terrible trouble. There's been like 5 or 6 versions. No one likes any of them. They can't get a director attached. It's the whole project's looking in trouble. And they kind of turn to Meyer for a kind of outside perspective. And he is an outsider. He'd never watched Star Trek. He said, if to me it was that show with the guy with the pointy ears, and if it came up on the television, I just kept going. Wasn't interested in it at all. Wasn't interested in science fiction. I mean, I had no background in the genre and no interest in acquiring a background in the genre. But was interested in, making a big movie, getting a big break, but also was fascinated, was very literary man, was fascinated by great literary themes, and didn't want to do science fiction. He wanted to do literary epics, and rather famously wanted to do Moby Dick, and couldn't get anyone to sort of finance it or do it. So this was an innovative solution, as we'll come to, for satisfying that particular desire. So Maya goes back and he watches episodes of the original series to try and get a feel for what's going on. And he concludes a few things. I mean, one is he doesn't buy the universe. And to him, he's like, why does the like inside of the Enterprise look like an IHOP or a what's that tacky like roadside motel at Howard Johnson's?
Right.
Like, why does it look? And he said, I just started asking myself, quite like, doesn't anyone ever go to the bathroom? Does no one read a book? What about if your eyes are bad? Does no one? And he's just like, I don't buy that. This is an unrealistic universe. Point one, he buys. He takes from this. Point two, as he's watching the original series, he's watching the hero, Captain Kirk. So I hate this guy.
Yeah.
Like, I really despise this guy. And what I hate about him is his like absolute insouciance. And I keep thinking, when is he going to get his comeuppance? Because he's doing all this stuff. We talked about what he did in Space Seed. Right. The other famous one, and this was not unusual for Star Trek. He jets into a situation, something is happening. He changes radically the rules of what's going on, and then just jets off to the next thing. And there's a rather famous one, I think it's called Taste of Armageddon, where he lands on a planet where they're having sort of fake computer-driven nuclear wars.
Okay.
And the equilibrium they've arrived at, the two sides on this planet, it's clearly a Cold War analog, is we will let a computer determine the results of each nuclear exchange, and then each side will put the number of people the computer said would have died basically into an incinerator.
Okay.
And this is better than the old situation where we were actually irradiating the planet and destroying infrastructure, and because we're clearly not going to escape this conflict. And Kirk says this is bonkers and disables the computer. And I've solved the problem, now no one else needs to go into the incinerator. Well, that's one possible outcome, right? The other outcome is they could just start firing the nuclear waste. Never goes back to check, jets off, and Maya says, I hate this guy. And so that is an important seed, I think, for the way that Kirk's character is treated in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And Maya says, what will be my way into this universe? I don't buy the world, I don't like the central character. What do I like about this, or how could I make it into something that I like? Well, I like these novels of Horatio Hornblower.
Yeah.
Sailing the high seas, in the great age of sail and galleon ships and cannons, and that I find really interesting. And what if I could remake elements of the universe and even elements of Kirk, and certainly elements of the way the ships operate and the way you shoot them and they move and everything, make it more like a great sort of age of sail, kind of galleon battle type scenario. That would be interesting. And what if, as the main character point, I took this idea of the hero who always got away with everything in his 30s, now in his 50s, and having to confront all of the stuff that he's done in the past. Yeah. As a diminished person, and what would that story be like? And that's kind of how we got to Wrath of Khan. Yeah,
and it's a fascinating analog to those kinds of old naval battles, because those battles, especially in that age, right, 1800s, these are battles that, for the most part, are self-contained. They're small. While they are part of a larger set of conflicts, typically when we think about, or when historians talk about these battles, they focus upon the very specific small elements, right, of each conflict, and they tend to focus on personality characteristics and the sort of development of character and the kinds of things that happen on the ships, right? So there's an internal politics as well that's important in navigating how these conflicts work out. And that's all also on display in The Wrath of Khan, which, exists within the world of Starfleet, but only barely. Yes. There are very few references to once the Enterprise is out on what starts off as a training mission, it's really out on its own.
That's key, and I think that is Maya taking from the Age of Sail the fact that distance really mattered, and if you did get trapped, particularly with a ship that's slightly faster than yours, which is the dynamic that's immediately set up once Reliant attacks Enterprise in that first encounter, Reliant is the superior starship, and that's not fixable, as it would have been in the original series with Scotty turning a wrench and suddenly the ship. It's like, no, there is now a permanent disparity here, and the Enterprise is trapped. It cannot escape from Khan. Which was also true in the Age of Sail. No one was coming over the horizon for several days. If they even knew you were in trouble. And that's the other thing. There's very little like communication with the world outside of Enterprise, Reliant, and the regular one space station. There's no sense of this great space navy that should be just over the horizon. Which, you're right, really makes the story small, or really focuses the stakes on this sort of tremendous, I know what you call it, cat and mouse game or clash of antagonists.
But of course, one way in which the story is not small is the way that it interrogates the relationship between military imperatives and scientific imperatives. And this is also a callback to what we see in Space Seed, right? In which you've got these scientists from the 1990s Earth who have genetically engineered a race of people in the name of kind of order, or put the potential of creating a kind of utopian order. We have an analog to that here in The Wrath of Khan, which is, the scientists, famously including, James Kirk's long lost or son, I suppose.
Yes.
They create this Genesis machine,
right,
which has the extraordinary power to create life from out of nothing, but also it, in the process of creating new life, will destroy anything that already exists. And so, just as the genetically engineered humans, of which Khan is a part, are intended as massive supports for humanity, right? As progressive kinds of creative forces, but actually end up being wholly destructive and tyrannical. So too does the Genesis scientific innovation contain within itself the seeds of mass destruction.
Yeah.
And just as the scientists in the 1990s Earth appear to be naive and arrogant about both about their own capabilities and about the purposes to which these new weapons, this new superbreed, can be put, so too are the scientists in The Wrath of Khan simultaneously arrogant about their capacities to create life and deeply naive about the overwhelming destructive potential of Genesis. So there is this analog, and it's a real life analog as well, right? And it calls back. It's especially interesting, I think, for a space movie to surface this tension between scientific and military imperatives, because it's a callback to NASA in the 1950s and 1960s. Congress supports NASA and supports all of the unmanned and then later manned space flights, not so much because of some great spirit of human innovation and pushing the borders of human knowledge and the like, but rather because they understand that space is an arena for Cold War battle.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's pretty clear now we're into the section of we usually call it surface politics or analogies between this kind of fictional world and the real world. I think that's a very acute analysis. It's definitely in there. I would even push it a step further, which is to say you can see the Genesis project and these scientists kind of sequestered away doing this thing in at least semi-secrecy as a sort of Manhattan Project analog. And the same tensions and the same, you could say, naivety on the part of the scientists and same military scientific tensions were, of course, present in the Manhattan Project, which the scientists build an atomic bomb to defeat Germany. On the belief that Germany was about to acquire an atomic bomb, and then were outraged, surprised, horrified to find that Germany wasn't, and the bomb wasn't going to be used against Germany, and they'd now created a permanent weapon of mass destruction. And I think there's a link between that and Genesis.
And in fact, the analog gets even deeper in both Space Seed or more obvious, I suppose, in both Space Seed and Wrath of Khan, because both Space Seed and The Wrath of Khan make very clear that the Enterprise is powered by atomic energy.
Yeah.
And so here, the Enterprise, it becomes, again, both the vehicle of salvation and a potential vehicle of mass destruction.
Yeah, or it is powered by a form of energy generation that generates radiation.
Yes.
So in universe, it's clearly an advanced, different form of
Yes.
physics process.
Right.
But you're right. It has the same.
It has the same
It's
effect.
clearly
It still
reads
kills
to us.
people.
Yeah, and there's even in the chamber, the engine room chamber where Spock dies, there's clearly visible radiation warning from, which is the same symbol you'd use in an atomic facility.
Yeah.
So I think that's absolutely true. And the tension is not only here between military and science, I should put it another way. The tension is the military scientific tension is brought into Star Trek by the tension between Nicholas Meyer's vision of Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek. And one of the consequences of Meyer being hired for Star Trek 2 and of the franchise being in trouble at that point was a sidelining of Gene Roddenberry from his own creation. And Roddenberry, of course, was the great utopian, the great believer in scientific progress as an unalloyed good, as the thing that was going to solve all humanity's problems, and as the thing that would give humanity space to escape what he saw as its infancy and become these kind of higher and more enlightened beings. And Nicholas Meyer says very directly that is just not a vision of humanity that I share.
Yeah.
And so by implication or extension, I also don't share that view that all scientific inventions are good scientific inventions. And so it is not surprising that Roddenberry's relationship to NASA, especially in the 60s, was essentially portraying Starfleet or the Federation as the natural successor of NASA.
Yep.
And what the moonshot was about and then the space program was about were the early steps of the production of the Starship Enterprise. Whereas Meyer, I think, understands some of the, I was going to say counter history, some of the actual history of that, which is all of these rocket ships had their roots in ballistic missile technology,
national security.
Yeah, and they were designed also to deliver nuclear weapons, and ultimately they all have their roots in Werner von Braun's V1 and V2 rockets for Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
So it's Meyer really brought that part of the story into much greater focus in Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
What else should we talk about in terms of surface politics? What about utilitarianism and the notion of the kind of rational actor, the person who makes decisions purely on the basis of a cost-benefit calculation? That's a very popular way to think about politics, that we encounter all the time in our careers, often seen as being portrayed fairly straightforwardly by the character of Spock. I mean, what do you make of the presence of those ideas in this movie?
I think the first thing to say, and again, this is one of the ways that Space Seed is really useful for framing the Wrath of Khan, is that the decision that Kirk makes to exile, not even to exile Khan, but to basically gift Khan a world,
planet,
is not utilitarian in the least.
Yeah.
It is a purely emotional decision that is based upon what's easiest for James Kirk in the moment. He doesn't want to face the decision of sending somebody to a penal colony, which I think is a pretty unusual position for him to be in, right? Although he is, he's got this sort of, and again, another hark back here to actual military and naval history, in which the captains of the ships were also vested with all penal authority. So Kirk has that too. But at least as we see it in the original series, correct me if I'm wrong, this is an unusual position for Kirk to find himself in, convening and presiding over a tribunal of the sort that he does in Space Seed. So he's clearly uncomfortable with that authority. And so he does the thing that's easiest for him, right? But in so doing, it's just a purely emotional and selfish decision. I mean, is there any doubt that were Spock in that position, that he would not have gifted a world to conquer to a murderous tyrant?
I think Spock of Space Seed would definitely not have done that, because in the original series they played Spock's utilitarianism much more literally and much more on the surface. There is one of the great themes, I think, of Wrath of Khan, and you'll have to tell me if I'm just imagining this or it really does exist, is that Spock is still portrayed as the great logician, and his most famous lines in the movie, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, are just very literal statements of the central principle of utilitarianism. My sense, though, is that just as Kirk is older and has maybe lost a step at the start of the movie, Spock is older and has gained a step and has gained a richness. And Spock, it seems to me, has imbibed a lot of Kirk's humanity and maybe even some of Kirk's out-of-the-box thinking or recklessness. Yeah, well, guile would be the way to do it. And that is a good distinction, because I think with Spock's great discipline, it is much more likely to become guile than recklessness, because he was always insulated from recklessness by his sort of philosophical thought system. But I think there's a lot of hints, and maybe they're not even hints, they're more on the surface on this, of Spock himself being a playful, out-of-the-box figure. So there's the great sort of humorous exchanges he has with Savick, and I think Savick is in there to portray a Vulcan at an earlier stage of development where she is much more literally utilitarian. Right. So Savick says after seeing Kirk, he's never what I expect, and Spock says, what do you mean? And she says, he's just so human. And Spock says, well, no one's perfect, Savick, which is actually quite a funny sort of line. There's the great moment where Kirk and McCoy come on the bridge and the Enterprise is about to be launched, and Spock's sitting in, he's the captain for the training voyage, and he's giving the directions, and he sees Kirk and McCoy, and he knows exactly, that Kirk's sort of jealous, and McCoy's always nervous of all the technology and everything. And Spock says, Mr. Savick, would you like to do the driving, to back the car out of the garage? And you can see Kirk and McCoy like they're really, really nervous. And Spock's like, Savick's like, I've never done this before. And Spock's like, well, there's a first time for everything. Don't you agree, Admiral? And he's like, McCoy's like, would you like a tranquilizer? And I think Spock is clearly trolling Kirk and sending him up. And I wonder if all this isn't leading us to think of Spock's sacrifice and Spock's utilitarianism as not in fact utilitarianism at all, as actually a very profound sacrifice that Spock will dress up as a rational choice, but he really is saving his friends. And ultimately his best friend, his double, someone who Spock, I think at this point sees has enriched his own life and sensibility and hinterland immeasurably, and loves this man in a way that is not reducible to a pure cost-benefit calculation, and wants to give him a rebirth or a second chance, and so feels the sacrifice not as a logical one, but as a deeply profound and emotional one. Well,
I think the two things can be true. Right. I think that's right, that this movie does take pains to display a kind of warmness about Spock's character development in the 15 years really since audiences have, I guess they've seen him in the motion picture, but and at the same time it's a warmth that maybe takes the harsh edges off of his utilitarianism, and does allow for the importance of things like sentiment as shaping the sorts of calculations that he would be otherwise inclined to think of as purely existing in the realm of logic. And that seems to be the meaning of his death scene and of his those last communications with Kirk. But it also, and we'll talk more about this, the transformation and the character growth of Spock, again, I think puts in relief the character development of Kirk. And we'll talk about, I think maybe we disagree a little bit about whether it's character growth or character regression in Kirk. But that notwithstanding, I do think you see that in Spock, and I do think the movie takes pains to portray him as having developed at least a different vision of how to make the calculations, right? If it's still mostly existing, if his behavior still and his decision-making still mostly exists in the realm of pure logic, he does seem to have gained an appreciation for how the calculations should be and can be shaped.
Yes. So just one more thing on this question of service policy. Sorry, I launched myself at you then. You sort of flinched. It's slightly alarming. One more thing on this question of surface politics, or politics on the surface, or analogies to things in our world. I really do think it's important. Maybe not for the politics of the movie, but just for the aesthetic experience of the movie, that the analogy is made both between the Enterprise and Reliant as kind of ships of the line, or sail ships, and I know we've talked about that a little bit. But also there's an analogy to kind of submarines and the great sort of submarine like Das Boot. And what I think that really gives the movie is just these tremendous sequences of stratagem and gambit, and especially once they go into the nebula and but actually even before that, the first sort of encounter is sort of suffused with deception and where is this person and what's going on, and I'm confused, and best guesses and all the rest of it. And it just, maybe it's like a fanboy thing to say or whatever, but I really think it helps the movie. It kind of grounds the movie in something that's real, and I think does important character work for Khan and Kirk.
No, I agree, and it's one of the things that I like about the action sequences, such as they are, is that they're not hyperkinetic action scenes. They're very, which is to say that they don't lean hard into special effects.
Yeah.
Right? That, I mean, just what you're talking about there with regard to the maneuvering of the ships in the nebula. Multiple scenes in which kind of one ship is sort of floating on top of the other.
Yes.
Or just kind of like coming around very quietly. That is the exact opposite of what you would expect in a space movie battle.
Yes.
Right? And I think that that's right. And it harkens back to that moment in which Spock and Kirk are kind of working out their strategy of battle. And, Kirk has seems to have a momentary flare-up of anxiety about his capabilities here. And Spock says, Khan is more intelligent, but he doesn't have experience.
Yes.
Right? And so this becomes critically important in the battle, right? That it's the experience that's going to win out. Right?
I agree.
Because that's the one thing you can't genetically engineer that.
Yes.
You can genetically engineer intelligence, strength, ambition, but you can't engineer experience.
Yes, and I think that's a crucial kind of exchange, and also a kind of beautifully constructed scene, because there's several things going on there. There's Kirk's self-doubt.
Yep.
He'll be back, but from where? And this is, of course, the second encounter, and Kirk has been burned.
Yep.
Badly by the first encounter, where he was caught with his breeches down, as he says it. There's Spock kind of helping Kirk to realize his inner qualities. This is a man who's having a midlife crisis, and his friend is standing him back on his feet and saying, "You are a worthwhile person. You have these skills." It's great strategy. I mean, it all makes sense, and you can really understand what's going on in the film. Great cinematography. His pattern shows he's intelligent but not experienced. His pattern shows two-dimensional thinking. And it really reinforces the friendship that Spock doesn't need to say the next part. You just see the little smirk on Kirk's face. They understand what's going on, which is, of course, there's 3 dimensions. If you're in a submarine type vessel, you can dive, and it works tremendously well. You see the Enterprise following, and there's a great, I realize I'm becoming very enthusiastic at this point. There's the great moment of catharsis for the audience, where you see the Enterprise like a shark's fin rise up behind, have this perfect firing angle, and you're like, shoot! Just tremendous, like cheering moments. But what Spock is saying here is, I without you have some of the faults of Khan. I'm intelligent, but I don't have that spark of thinking out of the box. So Spock's utilitarianism is also being interrogated here. A utilitarian, play the percentages, don't do the unexpected thing. That's probably what Khan's doing with the maneuvering.
But of course, Spock is the one who suggests. Right, it's actually Spock's idea.
Exactly.
Right,
exactly. Which shows what he's learned from and gained from a lifetime of experience with this, unconventional thinker, and and all the rest of it. So I think that's tremendous. The other point I wanted to make about this, and I don't know if it is politics or it's just cinematography, but who cares? The other point I wanted to make was some of the tension building techniques Maya uses as a filmmaker, which are very Hitchcockian.
Yeah.
And so in both of the major encounters between Enterprise and Reliance, there is the Hitchcockian technique of showing the audience something that at least one of the major protagonists doesn't know, which builds tension. And Hitchcock very famously said, if you have seen a few people sat around a dinner table and they talk for 5 minutes, it's the most boring movie scene in history. Like who would shoot that? Tension is this: show the audience there's a bomb under the table, and then shoot the exact same scene of the 5. That will be the tensest, most terrifying thing you've ever seen. And in both of those encounters, the audience is shown things that the protagonists don't know, that are characterologically relevant. So the audience knows Reliant has been commandeered by Khan and what Khan's intentions are. And all of that is not only transmitted by the fact we see Khan on the bridge, but the way Reliant is shot, the kind of spike of warlike music, very, very tense and warlike. But to Kirk, it's just a friendly starship meandering. So, and he doesn't take the precautions, and you're screaming at him, and he almost gets there. And every time.
It's not just that the audience knows that things are amiss and that Kirk should be putting the Enterprise into a warlike posture.
Right.
It's his own officers who are telling him.
Savik tells him. Yeah.
To take evasive action immediately, and he ignores her.
Yes.
So it's a striking moment of incompetence by Kirk. And again, it's a callback to the exact opposite things that he does in Space Seed, and confronted with a similar situation. The only difference is that in Space Seed, there's far less danger, actually, right? They know there's far less danger because there's essentially no signs of life on Khan's ship that they find.
And it's a very, very old ship.
And it's very old, right? So here, confronted with an objectively more dangerous situation, he is far lazier, far more, he's just lost, right? And he reacts in spite of getting very good advice. He ignores it.
Yes, absolutely. And then in the final confrontation, you've got a similar tension-building device in that where Reliant and Enterprise are in relation to one another, but they can't see each other, which is just tremendously well played as well, I think.
Yeah.
So good. I think that's probably it for surface politics.
Yep.
We should move now to a deeper examination of some of the mythologies that are present in this movie, as we commonly do in these discussions. So, discussions of mythologies. I think there's a lot going on in terms of mythologies in this movie. I have down here several, and you'll have to tell me where to start, and we can work our way through them or around them.
Well, let's start with the biblical references.
Okay, so lots of Bible action going on. Spock calls it out explicitly at one point in the movie, where Kirk's, characteristically as he is for the majority of the movie, confused, and Carol said to him that they're coming to take Genesis. Why are they doing that? And Kirk's like, what does she mean? Who's coming to? And Spock says, well, it would help me if I knew what Genesis was beyond the biblical reference.
Right.
So there's that biblical element into it that in the movie. There's obviously the resurrection storyline, that's going on in the movie. There's an element we should talk about in what I would say is the Garden of Eden. And where do you want to start with this panoply of biblical?
Let's start with the name of the scientific, super weapon / creative force, Genesis.
Yes.
So this is clearly a reference to the book of Genesis and to the Christian origin stories, in which an omniscient and all-knowing and all-powerful God creates the universe and all things within it from out of nothing, which is what the scientists imagine Genesis is doing. Now, immediately, though, there's a disconnect in the reference, because in the book of Genesis, God creates the universe and all of its things out of nothing. What Genesis, the scientific invention, does is it creates new life, whether there's nothing there or whether there's already existing life there, which means that embedded within the very possibilities of creation are the seeds of destruction.
Yes.
And the movie makes that quite clear on multiple occasions that this device will wipe out whatever exists to create something new. So there's this way in which, but the scientists don't seem to get that, right? This is their naivete about the uses to which their device is likely to be put.
I think that they understand that effect and that they're committed to it because the Reliant originally is on a mission to find a completely lifeless world, and they say there can't even be like so much as a microbe. Where they're naive is what's going to happen once you've created this weapon.
And they imagine themselves, as McCoy says, as gods.
Yes.
Right, which also harks back to to the Manhattan Project.
Yes.
Right? And look upon my invention.
Yeah.
Right?
I am become God, the destroyer of worlds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the choice of Genesis is actually discordant with the actual capabilities of the device in a certain way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Discordant because
it contains within it the very real possibility of destruction.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
And so the analogy to the Christian biblical story is not really.
Yes, I see.
It's half of the story.
Right.
Right.
I wonder if it's Mayer's anti-utopianism that's coming in here. That the sort of great utopian promise of creating a new society, and it will inevitably be better, and that's the Roddenberry view on Star Trek.
Right.
The anti-utopian view is, of course, that any utopian effort it is much more likely to be destructive than constructive, and whatever is the imperfections of the existing thing should be honoured and made better, but the good in it conserved. And any radical change will lead to tyranny and destruction and terror.
Yeah. And it also strikes me now that we're talking about it that when Reliant is, at the beginning of the movie, when Reliant is on its scouting mission, right, looking for uninhabited and non-biological planets, Chekhov and the captain of the Reliant, whose name Tyrrell, are play pretty fast and loose with the idea that there might not be life on this planet.
Well, they're bored of the mission. They want to go off and do something else.
Yeah, and they don't even want to go down and scout.
No.
Right? They basically so there's this attitude that they don't really care.
Yeah.
Like if they end up destroying some stuff,
it's their job. They're like contractors who've been hired by, by the Karl Marx's group, and they're just like, if we cut this tiny corner, who's really gonna know?
Right. And the only reason they go down to check it out is because the scientists insist upon it. So the scientists imagine themselves. I mean, they're not wholly naive, but they do imagine themselves as more powerful than they really are.
Yeah.
Right. They imagine themselves as being able to put some guardrails around the use of Genesis.
Yes.
That really only exist because of the willingness of military officers to comply.
Right.
Right. I mean, Chekhov and Tyrrell could have just said, "Yeah, we did that. It's fine."
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's only their willingness to comply, which the scientists have no ability actually
to enforce, which is always the problem with scientists, especially when they get entangled with the military, which David, Kirk's son, says pretty directly and seems to have constantly held that view. And that also is interesting that David is in many ways like Kirk, Carol says, but he holds a completely different philosophy of life, and this is the absence of fatherhood. Who would David have been if Kirk had been around? But he's become he's clearly a forthright, thrusting, rule breaking sort of individual. So he has those characters for courageous like his father.
We'll talk about this later. But I think very different in critically important ways.
Yes. Kirk. Yes.
And in ways that
sort of emotionally intelligent.
Do not redound to Kirk's benefit.
No. No. A couple of the biblical things we should talk about. One is in terms of Spock as, you know, the Jesus figure, as a figure who is resurrected. A couple of interesting elements here. One is the torpedo that becomes Spock's coffin, which looks like a coffin more than a munition. I mean, interesting commentary on the duality of war there, I guess. But it's clearly marked like the Mark 6 torpedo, like a biblical verse. I don't think it's a particularly relevant biblical verse for this thing, but it always occurred to me that was not by accident.
Well, and there are the allusions to, you know, the shrouding of Jesus, right?
Exactly.
And the what will eventually be the Shroud of Turin, right?
Yes.
And the kind of the implantation of Jesus's body in this kind of sacred space.
Yes,
right.
Yes. And there is an irony, or it was a very brave thing for the movie to do, to cast Spock in this sense, or in this instance, as a Jesus-like figure, because when the Spock character was first floated in the original series, there was fears, and I think actually instances of television stations, particularly in very conservative Christian parts of America, refusing to run the series because Spock, with his green pointed ears, came off as a kind of devil figure, or was read as an allusion to a satanic figure, and there was this fear this would sink the show in parts of America, which didn't quite happen. But it is a nice, you know, Nimoy writes about this in his memoirs. It is a nice callback that by this point, or turnaround, that by this point Spock is so beloved that he can be unproblematically represented as a Jesus figure.
Interesting.
I think we should talk also about.
Well, let's just
go ahead.
Before that, when you started talking about the resurrection story, I actually thought you were talking about Kirk.
Okay.
So let's dig in on Kirk a bit.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think the one way to read his character trajectory is that at the beginning of the movie, this is somebody who is reckoning with his age, who's no longer in control of the Enterprise. He's been promoted to admiral, so he's kind of in an oversight role.
Yeah.
He's
an administrator
basically. Yeah. And the movie makes very clear that, I mean, basically we have a person who is in a state of depression.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the mythology, just to headline this, the mythology would be what, like the hero's progress or journey, or the evolution of the patriarch or the father figure, or all of those things.
Yeah, I think. One way.
The deconstruction of the hero.
Yeah, the aged hero.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I think it's not clear how old Kirk is supposed to be. He seems
mid-50s.
Mid-aged, maybe a little younger than that.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how old he's supposed to be in the series.
Yes.
But he does appear to be in a position where, you know, he needs reading glasses. And he's increasingly in this kind of contemplative state. And as you were saying yesterday when we were talking in advance, that he's short with people. Right, he doesn't seem to have the kind of charisma the interpersonal charisma that was kind of his brand.
He's super obnoxious, like with everyone.
Right, he's short with everyone. He's kind of snippy.
Horrible teacher. You know, he's supposed to be teaching.
Disinterested. He's just disinterested, right? Which. You know,
well, but also kind of pontificating about things.
Yeah,
and...
I mean, he's in a depressive state. I think clearly, and so he's portrayed as reckoning with a different set of circumstances in his life that has led him to be more contemplative about decisions that he has made. Maybe contemplative for the first time in his life about decisions that he has made prior and about the costs of those decisions. The most important of which is that this is a figure who is. He is alone. He's not surrounded by anyone. And in fact, one of the things that you see that kind of enlivens him is being around his old crew again.
Yes.
But it's made clear that that's an unusual, it's not clear how often that happens.
Right.
So there's a way of reading this movie in which, you know, and I think this is certainly the way that Kirk himself would like to have the movie read if he could so do it, this is a guy who starts off, he's past his prime, he feels old, as he says, he feels worn down, he's contemplative for probably the first time in his life about decisions that he's made in the past, he's beginning to feel regrets, And he is an isolated and solitary figure who is kind of out of place. And that as the movie goes on, he refines this kind of old spark, and he regains this sense of self-belief and confidence, and he, by the end of the movie, now feels young again. Right? And he's Kirk again.
Yes.
Right? And so there is a kind of resurrection or rebirth sort of cycle that's in there that is probably most famously or infamously depicted, as rebirths almost always are, with when they're in the cave, the sort of the test cave that Genesis has created new life in, which is very clearly vaginal, right?
Yes.
And it's in that moment that he's kind of sparked back to life.
Yes.
So I think that's, a pretty uncontroversial way of reading the trajectory of Kirk. But I wonder if that actually can be turned on its head, and that Kirk has not been resurrected or rather he has been resurrected into his old hero-like form, but the problem is that hero-like form in the first place. Because remember what has gotten him and everybody else in the Enterprise into this problem in the first place.
Yes.
It was his behavior as a selfish hero in the first place 15 years ago.
Yes.
Right? His unwillingness to make hard decisions, his unwillingness to expose himself to discomfort, his unwillingness, in Spock's words, to put the needs of the many in front of the desires of the few, or the one.
Him.
Yes. Right? And
I mean, literalized in the abandonment of a child.
And then literalized, right? Which, so this is the heroic self that he's recapturing at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
So, in contrast to Spock, who has meaningful character growth, aren't we just seeing a recycling of the same kind of dysfunctional, charismatic figure that we had in the TV show?
Yes, I think that's a highly plausible reading. I mean, it's one of those where I've really got to think carefully about what I say, because I think and I did think this would happen, where my emotions are going to collide with my intellect, because I love this movie so much and I identify with that character, and particularly that iteration of the character, the iteration of the Kirk character in this movie. I've always found very, very a very powerful presentation of a figure that, for reasons I'm not sure I can articulate, I find extremely compelling. Intellectually, I think you are right, and it would not surprise me if this was yet another Nicholas Meyer subversive move. And the great genius is that he's allowed the vast majority of the audience who loves Kirk to think that what's been done here is the resurrection of the Kirk character. But actually, much more profoundly, has been the demonstration that no improvement is possible within the framework of the Kirk character.
It's a regression.
Yeah.
From this perspective, it's a regression. Right? Because on you might be inclined to think of the middle-aged depressive Kirk as that's the tragedy. But from another perspective, he's actually beginning for the first time in his life to do the hard work to mature.
Yes.
And to gain wisdom.
Right.
Right? To start to think back about the recklessness with which he's conducted his life, and the selfishness and narcissism with which he's conducted his life. And that's difficult work for anybody, but it's especially difficult work for a character like Kirk. But what's striking is that none of his friends, none of the people around him are actually supporting him in that work. Every single one of them is encouraging his regression back to this kind of carefree, narcissistic self.
Yes.
Including Spock.
Yes.
And so, from this perspective, his friends are actually his enablers. This is a guy in the middle of maybe finally working himself into a state of mature wisdom, right? Being a mentor. Being somebody who can help others realize their abilities. And instead, right, his friends are so discomfited by the difficulties that they see that he's experiencing that they do everything they can to enable him to regress back to this
Yes.
kind of dysfunctional emotional state.
Yes.
And so, ironically, they're not helping actually at all. So, I think that's the alternative view, right? Is that we see, as an audience, we see a character who by this point is beloved, and it's a character for whom we have a very particular set of expectations about how he's going to behave. And we see him in the process of a kind of fits and starts of maturity. And it's too difficult to look at.
Yes.
And so our inclination is we need to get him back to the more familiar view without any regard about where that puts him as a human being, right? I mean, as we talked about yesterday, the end, one of the final scenes is really striking to me when he's asked, I think it's McCoy, who asks Kirk after the burial of Spock and after they send him off, into space like a Viking, being sent out to sea.
Yes.
McCoy asks Kirk, "How do you feel?" Right? And earlier, when the mother of his child has asked him how he feels, he says, "I feel old and I feel worn out."
Yeah.
And now he responds to McCoy, "I feel young."
Yes.
Now, I posit that is not how somebody who had progressed and had become a wiser and more mature person would respond.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a binary between young and old.
Yeah.
It would be, I feel something like I feel wise, or I feel myself, or I feel at ease,
Yeah.
I feel okay.
Yes.
Right? It's regression.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Right?
That's really interesting. So I'm trying to verbalize a visceral response I have to this man and to this character. I think the thing that has always appealed to me about the character in this story, and actually I'm going to have to critique this once I've said it, but I want to be honest, is that this is what I think I have thought for a long time, is he is shown to be vulnerable for really the first time, and there's something very appealing about that, right? The hero figure, or really the father figure, you're shown that person's vulnerability, like that really resonates with people. It resonates with me. And he's put in a situation where he's responsible for huge numbers of people, including all those people who are closest to him, his peers, but then a whole shipload of, presumably several hundred children, essentially, very, very young adults, who are being pursued by a genuine murderous threat, and the murderous threat has the upper hand. And really the only thing that is keeping everything together, that is holding together what is an absolutely terrified ship, who, if you remember the first time they're attacked, one reason the Enterprise suffers so badly is that all the trainees abandon all their posts, so they don't keep the ship going, and that nothing can really be done. The only figure that's unifying things and keeping things on track and keeping things moving forward is Kirk, who, even though he's in a vulnerable state and he's feeling kind of terrible, has to assume that burden. He feels very deeply the losses. There's the famous scene with the loss of Peter Preston, the cadet. Literally has the blood, I mean, not on his hands but on his chest, and carries it around like a wound. So he's wounded. And the only thing that keeps these people alive, that's giving them a fighting chance to survive, is not only Kirk, the hero and the genius and the great sort of veteran of daring do, but in particular this newly vulnerable, old, experienced version of Kirk, who's been pushed to the limits of his understanding, to come up with stratagems and ploys and ways of projecting authority and confidence and all the rest of it, that's keeping everything together. And there's something I just find very viscerally appealing about that. Okay, so that I think has been my classic approach to this movie before I've been forced to confront it intellectually in dialogue. Here's what I wonder, and a lot of this has occurred to me over the past couple of days and while you've been talking recently. Here is what I wonder if what is really going on in my head, which is I'm not identifying with Kirk. I'm identifying with David, with his son. And that what's appealing to me about the Kirk character is the father who's shown to be vulnerable, and the father who is lost and who is then you have this kind of reconciliation with, and there's the physical moment of affection between them that's initiated by David, but is but it's the son reaching out for a father's love, but the father reciprocates.
Yeah, so I think that, that's very interesting. We'll talk about that. But I think the first thing is to remember why it is that Kirk is in this position of protector in the first place.
Yeah.
It's entirely his fault.
Yeah.
And his incompetence that has led to this situation in which he has to try to hold the crew together. Right? He has been told by Saavik, and I think Spock is clearly shown as agreeing with Saavik, that he needs to respond more quickly, that this is a very dangerous situation, and Kirk has been slow on his feet here.
Right.
And so that's the first. I think you have to not. I don't want to get carried away with imagining him as protector when when it's his incompetence that has created the danger in the first place.
I suppose from the standpoint of a
Yeah.
David figure, like his parents, his father left, his parents split up. Like in a divorce, the parents are clearly at fault, right? The child didn't do it from the child's standpoint, and Kirk is clearly at fault for the situation that's being created. That doesn't mean that the child doesn't yearn for reconciliation and to be able to see the father in a positive light.
And clearly David does. But the other thing that I note about that interaction is that it's entirely David who is behaving in the generous and graceful ways.
Yes.
Right? And this is why David is not like Kirk.
Yeah.
Right? In spite of what his mother says, right? As you say, there might be a kind of a certain boldness in spirit and approach that the two share, but there's an emotional maturity and ability and capacity that David has as, 20 years old, maybe at most.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe he's even younger than that.
Yeah.
That Kirk can only dream of.
Yes.
It's David who reconciles. It's David who puts aside the feeling of abandonment and embitteredness. He's the one who grows. Remember, at the beginning of the movie, he seems to know that Kirk is his father, but he just sort of he pretends that he doesn't know, and he says, that old space pirate that used to hang around.
Yeah. Boy Scout.
Yeah, in very dismissive ways,
yes.
right?
Okay, so we're back.
So, David's character is very interesting, and the reconciliation theme is strong, for sure, between the estranged son and the father. But again, it's not clear to me that this represents meaningful growth for Kirk.
Yeah.
It seems to me that all of the generous and graceful behavior in the reconciliation is not only initiated, but also orchestrated by David himself.
Right.
David is the abandoned son. David is the one who is embittered. But he's the one who gets over it. He's the one who makes and he's the one who verbalizes, right, his pride. And he's also extremely generous and graceful because he doesn't force Kirk to admit that Kirk is his father, right? So the emotional maturity...
Or that he's been an absent father.
Or that he's been absent, right? Exactly. So all of the emotional capacity and maturity, even in that reconciliation scene, is coming from David, not from Kirk. And Kirk, it's meaningful, can't actually verbally respond. Right? He responds through signs with a hug.
Right.
But he doesn't have the capacity to respond at all.
No.
To David.
Right.
So again, even in that moment where you want to see a kind of redemptive arc, it's not clear that that's what you're getting from Kirk. Which maybe points to this sort of broader critique that Nicholas Meyer is offering that links to utopian thinking.
Yeah.
But about the capacity for people to change, essentially to expunge those dysfunctional, shameful elements of their selves and of their behavior.
And so let's move into that section. I mean, we do classically reserve our final section for the deepest possible cut here, what is being problematized or challenged by what's going on in these movies. And you think the way to think about Khan is the critique of really any form of utopianism.
It certainly seems like a utopia led by a heroic figure, a heroic singular figure is being interrogated
in both the Kirk and the Khan character.
both,
I see. Yes.
in both, is being kind of put up on the operating table, interrogated, and just flayed.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because, they are kind of analogs of one another,
Yeah.
Kirk and Khan, right?
Starts with K, 4 letters. How did that happen? I mean, that's
amazing.
Yeah.
But you get they're both responsible for a group of people, essentially a colony of people. They both engage in hubristic, emotional behavior that is vindictive, that's goading, that is barely within the realm of obvious logic. And in both cases, they get a lot of people they're responsible for killed.
So is the critique here
In other words, they create the conditions of their own demise.
Yes. Is the critique here actually middle-aged male leadership? In both instances, it doesn't come off very well.
Exactly, which has in the American tradition frequently been figured as heroic leadership, right? Which is probably another reason that Roddenberry doesn't like this, right? Is that
as a middle-aged male leader,
but as somebody who imagines utopian possibilities according to a particular model of how do you want it, unified leadership, charismatic leadership. I mean, what Meyer is saying here is that leadership is almost by definition autocratic and authoritarian and brutal, and also ineffective. It doesn't do the thing, right? It doesn't do the thing that it promises.
Yes.
Right? If the Enterprise and the Reliant under Khan's command are microcosms of utopian worlds where everybody gets along together, everybody works towards a higher purpose, where there's kind of order and everybody knows their place, what this movie displays is that they are just catastrophes waiting to happen, right? That these kinds of utopias are led by barely stable emotional characters, and who make bad decisions even when they are given good advice, right? Who can't control their emotions in meaningful ways, who lack the discipline to actually be leaders of people, and who have no meaningful interest in ensuring that the people over whom they have nominal charge are living in and working in an environment that allows them to be their best.
Yes.
So I think it's the yoking of the utopian vision with this kind of style of charismatic leadership and heroism that Meyer seems to be really torpedoing, so to speak.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And rather famously, Meyer didn't. The ending of the film, and certainly the kind of sequel film, was not what Meyer thought the story was or should be. And I wonder if what he was really trying to say was exactly what you've said, right? This kind of utopianism matched with middle-aged, thrusting men is going to lead to disaster. Therefore, you have to get them out of the way, right? Khan literally explodes. I mean, he literally blows himself up.
Yep.
Kirk, we are maybe getting a nod and a wink that I feel young and I'm returned is a bad thing, not a good thing. Maybe that's what Meyer's trying to tell us. So who is Meyer? Spock is dead.
Yeah.
Right. So he's really viciously getting rid of as many people from the old generation as he can. Who are the new protagonists, it seems? Savick probably is one.
David.
And David.
Yeah.
Okay, so Savick, female, mentored by Spock, a logician, but already curious about this kind of melding with humanity and leading in that way. And he has been presented with both the successes and the failures of the old model of leadership, and has actually rather acutely identified the obvious failures along the way. David, who has elements of Kirk in him, and that same sort of adventurousness, but has been brought up not in a military male-dominated organization, but in a scientific female-led organization, and as you've, I think, accurately pointed out, is now a much more emotionally intelligent, mature figure than his father at a much earlier stage in his development. So maybe that's where Meyer thought the that society could most progressively go. Now, what happens in the next movie, which Maya refuses to be a part of, Maya says Spock is dead. That's what the movie is. Didn't participate in the shooting of the final scene where it showed that Spock's coffin has soft landed and there's all this verdant life, which is pretty obviously pointing as to what's going to happen. And turned down the chance to direct the next movie, largely on that basis that he said, I've told this story, it goes here. It doesn't go into Spock's resurrection. The other things that happen in the third movie is David is killed.
Yeah.
Pretty unceremoniously in the, ending that line of possible new leadership. And Kirk remains in the captain's chair and again pulls off a similar daring do escape, to live to fight another day. So really that is interesting. I mean, that would lead us to think that Maya has put together an anti-utopian movie, but it's not anti-utopian in a conservative way, in that it is simultaneously a critique of patriarchal male leadership models. So it is pointing to something different and progressive. Yeah. But not in the utopian way that so often comes with science fiction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's from this perspective, this is a sort of searing criticism of Reagan era leadership histrionics.
Yes.
And I think it's really interesting to imagine Saavik and David as paired would be.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Protagonists.
Yes.
Because remember who is most curious about how it is that Kirk has cheated the simulation.
Yeah.
The
Kobayashi Maru.
Yeah. Right. It's Saavik.
Yes.
Right. Because Kirk refuses to face death.
Yeah.
Which is another way of saying, what is death? Well, facing death is one of the foremost responsibilities, right, that people will ever. It's one of the foremost experiences of having to grieve.
Yeah.
And Kirk won't do it.
Yeah.
Right? He does everything that he possibly can to avoid that responsibility to himself and to others, right? And Saavik can't understand, right? You don't cheat death. You have to face it, right?
And he says that to her, but he doesn't mean it.
He doesn't mean it because he doesn't want to do it,
right?
Right? And I question whether he's facing death at the end.
Yes.
Right? I mean, he sort of is, but Spock's going to come back.
Yes. I mean, to be generous, if you take the movie the way Maya intended it, and you're as generous as you can be to the Kirk character, he is providing an example at the end of how to finally face death to Saavik and David, even though they probably already know more about it than he did. But he does suffer.
But there's a strange lack of gravity
to
his responses in those moments.
You think so? You don't.
How do you feel? Says McCoy. I feel young.
Yeah.
You've just buried your best friend,
right,
and sent him off into space like a Viking.
Okay, so that was our discussion of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Which we both really enjoyed revisiting.
Really enjoyed revisiting. What should people do if they like the video?
Smash that like button and subscribe.
And hit the notifications so you get notified when a new video drops. Also follow the link below where you will find details on UConn's Master's Program in Politics and Popular Culture, which is replete with discussions of this nature on things of this type.
Exactly. So we've enjoyed ourselves, and we'll see you soon.
On that bombshell.
Yeah.